Hello, everyone. My name is Devin Blocker, and you are listening to the Bookshelf Podcast. The center focus of this podcast is to invoke our imaginations and curiosity through stories. As humans, storytelling is an innate ability of our species. We define everything through a narrative or a story. From the stories we tell our kids, to the stories of history, to the stories of our lives. Let's explore some interesting stories and stimulate our imaginations. I am no professional and am underqualified to talk about these topics, but for the love of learning, I hope we all learn something new. Hello, everyone. I have an interesting book with me today, and that book is Corruptible: Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us by Klaas. Klaas, the author, grew up in Minnesota, and he earned his DPhil or PhD at Oxford and is now a professor of global politics at University College London. He is a contributing writer for The Atlantic and was formerly a weekly columnist for The Washington Post. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the book today, but if you would like a copy, you can find it on Amazon, and that is where I found mine. So stories of power and corruption have always been interesting. We've all heard the quote that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that sometimes even the best people given enough power and authority over others tend to abuse that power. This book, Corruptible, goes into story after story of people abusing their power, and the author looks into why humans do the things we do, and even gives his expertise and insight on how we can put better systems in place to maybe curb some of the corruption that we see of today. One of the things he talks about early on in the book is how some people are drawn to power while other people shy away from it, and that those who are drawn to power are usually drawn to power for the wrong reasons. And I love the analogy he uses. He says that the people that are drawn to power are like moths to a flame. One reason the author gives us is that essentially we have Stone Age brains that haven't changed much over the past 200,000 years, but what has changed is the environment and societies we have built. What does this mean? It means the qualities and characteristics we look for in a leader hasn't changed, but the reality we live in has, and that those old concepts are ill-suited for the societies of today. The author also talks about the power of delusion and how we often pick leaders on faulty notions like picking someone that looks the part. Which relates to another part of the book, which is the power of delusion and how our caveman brains produce heavy biases like picking people because they look like you or come from the same race, as well as baby-facedness, which suggests that people that look younger or innocent are oftentimes perceived in that manner solely based on their looks of innocence. A story that supports this is an industry in China that uses foreigners such as white Americans as props to lend credibility to corporations and operations. So the book talks about an industry in China where these Chinese corporations essentially reach out to Americans and pay them to look the part of a CEO. Now, these Americans usually don't have the credentials of being a CEO, nor know anything of the corporations that they're signing up to be the CEO of, but the objective of this is to produce a chimera or an illusion, because these corporations are seeking prestige, they're seeking investors, as well as boosting the morality of their teams. So they rent these Americans and dress them up as CEOs and have them walk around the facility and pay them to look the part of an American CEO investing into a Chinese corporation. Let's look at another story of corruption, this time a story of a corrupt janitor living in New York. This one is one of my favorites just because of how insane it is. So a guy named Stephen Rauchi is working as a school maintenance guy. He's making roughly $42,000 a year. But this tyrannical psychopath gets his boss fired, and that's where the story starts. So the school gets an upgrade in their system's ability to monitor energy consumption, and they task this guy with monitoring the energy consumption of the school. But this guy isn't very tech savvy, and that's where Rauchi comes in. Because Rauchi, on the other hand, is very tech savvy, and he informs this guy that he could alleviate some of his job duty by monitoring the system for him. And so this guy agrees to Rauchi's idea of letting him help monitor the school's consumption. Once Rauchi got the green light, he began working on a sinister plan. He began artificially raising the energy consumption of the school. He did so by leaving on lights and raising the heat of the school. This raised a red flag because obviously this was at odds of what the school asked. They wanted to manage the school's energy consumption in order to lower the school's costs, not to raise them. This led to the termination of the guy that was in charge of managing the new system. That's when Stephen Rauchi conveniently suggested that he would be the perfect fit. After all, he was tech savvy and understood the system. And bam, just like that, he went from $40,000 salary to a six-figure salary overnight. But he was a tyrannical psychopath. This newfound power was getting to his head, and he went on to abuse his authority in such ways like shutting off the lights and turning down the heat in the school. The school started complaining, the faculty members started complaining to the school board that the school was cold, and other things started coming up, such as the coffee machines in their classrooms, the cords would be cut. And then one teacher went on to buy a space heater, and it mysteriously went missing. And it wasn't the students who took the space heater, it was the maintenance guy, Steve Rauchi. But he wanted more power, because the new power he had wasn't enough. So he started campaigning for the union and wanted to be a part of the school board that makes decisions. When colleagues wrote letters of concern to the school board about him, Rauchi took it upon himself to punish anyone who crosses him. The Grays, one of his colleagues, he painted the words "rat" right on their house. Another colleague named Gary that made a complaint to the school board found his vehicle tire slashed and some kind of explosive device on the windshield. Rauchi's underlings started to park in a Home Depot parking lot to avoid damage to their cars. Rauchi started surrounding himself with supporters. He started by giving money to those in need because, he had money now with his new six-figure job. His appetite for power was growing, but so was the threat of it all crashing down. The police were on to him. They had bugged his classroom, and they collected evidence from silverware at a restaurant he had recently visited. In the audio from the classroom, you can hear how deluded he was talking to the informant. He often went back and forth between first and third person, talking about how the world would be a better place if there was just more Steve Rauchis in the world. When he was eventually caught, they found that in his classroom he had explosive devices on standby on school grounds. They had all the evidence they needed. They charged him and sentenced him to prison. Another interesting story is when the author of the book sits down and interviews the former Prime Minister of Thailand, Abist Vijaya. Sorry if I butchered the pronunciation of that. He was accused of mass murder when protests broke out in 2010, calling for him to resign his power. Some of his military started to deflect. They started to mix in with the protests, making a real threat for a civil war. The Prime Minister restored order with power. He gave orders to shoot protesters. 87 deaths later, the protesters surrendered. The question is, did he have to sacrifice a fraction to save the masses? This next one takes us back to World War II and illustrates a dilemma that leaders face. Sometimes leaders do make selfish, evil decisions, and other times good leaders have to make hard decisions in impossible scenarios. Winston Churchill and the US government had cracked the German military code. The secret remained amongst top officials. The problem? If you counteract every action the opposing military makes, chances are they will figure out you're listening. On November 19, 1941, the HMAS Sydney, a cruiser in the Australian Navy, was under attack. Churchill had pre-hand knowledge of the attack, but because of fear of the enemy finding out that they had cracked the code, they remained silent while all 645 people died for the war effort. We'll take a look at one more story where a person in a position of power faced impossible choices, and how these choices were the choices of playing a god. During Hurricane Katrina at Memorial Hospital, Doctors worked hard to provide health care during a natural disaster. Energy and supplies were dwindling, and help seemed to never be coming. The hospital staff started categorizing patients from least to worse: ones, twos, and threes. Threes were the ones that were deemed irredeemable, so Dr. Anna Powell found herself playing God. Who gets medical treatment and who doesn't? Who lives and who dies? Dr. Anna Powell mixed lethal doses of medicine and started administering them to the people that were categorized as threes. Some of these people that were categorized as threes just because of their obesity. They figured that it was unrealistic to treat and move these people due to their weight. Dr. Powell went to the 7th floor to start her serial homicide. After a few hours, every patient on the floor died. In the aftermath, forensic examiners determined homicide, but the grand jury refused to indict her. The question is, does power make people worse, or do they appear to be worse because of the increase in opportunity? Let's take a look at people or systems. Are people corrupt, or are systems corrupt? What happens if you put a good person in a bad system? The year is 1865, and when history speaks of King Leopold II, it seems he was a benevolent king when it came to his homeland in Belgium, but he is rather more infamous in another land. He embarked on his infamous journey by reading books on colonialism. He then bought land in Africa for himself and found he was sitting on a profitable resource: rubber. Rubber was in high demand in other parts of the world, so he tyrannized the locals by kidnapping the women and taking children hostages and negotiating a deal with the men that they could free them if they harvested enough rubber. They raped and captured the women and cut off their hands to enforce compliance. In today's currency, he made the equivalent of billions. Let's talk about a few stories where people are rigging the system or getting good at being bad, and how by putting better systems in place, it can help eliminate certain levels of corruption. This first one takes place in the early 2000s. The government in Ukraine at the time devised a strategic election manipulation. The ruling party staged disappearing ink pens in voting areas of opposition. You could see how by having better systems in place, you could curb some of this corruption. The next one takes place in Zimbabwe. They had an impressive manipulation plan that took 18 years to bear fruit. The government would systematically fail to provide birth certificates to districts in opposition. 18 years later, when that populace could vote, they could not register to vote because identity could not be verified. And finally, one that takes us back to the US. Before 1987, to get a tax break, families just needed to list their dependents on a form. An employee working for the IRS wondered if people were listing fake people or pets to get tax breaks. So in 1987, the IRS required people to list their social security number next to the claimed dependents. Overnight, the US population lost 7 million people. The evidence suggests that 1 in 10 people did not exist. Some families were bold enough to list 10 fake dependents. After the changes on the tax form, the government found they had an additional $2.8 billion to the budget. So you can see how having better systems in place can help curb some of the corruption that we see. Now let's talk of the effects power has on the body. An interesting study was done by Dr. Michael Nadar, an experiment on macaque monkeys. He used macaque monkeys because other primates were too closely related to Homo sapien. The experiment was conducted to study social orders and to see if how being in power can change your body. Researchers let 4 monkeys into one room for them to figure out the social hierarchy. Once established, dominant to subordinate, researchers set up a binary lever system, one for cocaine and one for food. Once the macaque monkeys were acquainted with what lever did what, they scanned their brains to see any changes. What is conducted is that the ones in power could pick food over drugs, but the subordinates would pick drugs over food. When researchers scanned the brains of the macaque monkeys, they found that their brains changed in a way to have less D1 receptors, receptors that are addiction receptors, and more D2 receptors, which is the receptors for quitting cold turkey. So power changed their brains. It changed their brains in ways in which the dominant monkeys had healthier brain composition than the subordinate monkeys. The monkeys at the bottom of the totem pole had a difficult time adjusting to their environment, so they relied more on drugs, as opposed to the alphas that enjoyed the benefits of food. Which brings me to another interesting study that was done that looks at the relationship between our social lives and our immune system. A study was done between the years 1997 and 2001. It included 159 men and 175 women. Researchers wanted to inject these subjects with the common cold virus and determine how our social lives affect our immune systems. The study concluded that those who were more introverted with low social lives were more prone to becoming sick, and those with strong social networks had more resilient immune systems. Professor Tung at Duke then took the study to macaque monkeys. In this study, he moved the dominant monkeys to positions of the subordinate monkeys and the subordinate monkeys to the position of the dominant monkeys. Researchers concluded that the immune response was stronger the higher you went up the hierarchy, in addition to having stronger social networks. So, for humans to be healthy, increase how much control you have of your life, as well as increasing your social ties in your life. The author gives us some lessons towards the end of the book to help remedy some of the corruption we see in today's society. One of the early lessons is deepening and broadening applicants. Essentially what this means is to diversify the pool of applicants you are pulling from, as well as increasing the number of applicants that are applying for the position you're hiring for. A story comes from a small town in Alaska that felt the repercussions of not adhering to this lesson. In late October 2010, Kyle Hopkins, an investigative reporter for Anchorage Daily News, was investigating corruption in a small town named Stebbins that had a population roughly 500. On October 16, 2010, a guy named Nimrod Mike, a criminal who broke into a couple's house and started attacking the man of the home. The homeowner was able to escape through the front door while calling for help, but that's when the intruder turned his murderous intentions to the woman still inside the house. He strangled her to the point of unconsciousness. When she started to regain her consciousness, the intruder was undoing her pants. She quickly scrambled to her feet and hit him with an unloaded shotgun. The police came and arrested the guy. Fast forward 10 years, and this multi-felon criminal holds a job as a police officer. Every single officer in this town had a criminal rap sheet. When the local officials were pressured to answer, they said they had to lower the recruitment standards because no one was applying. The only ones who were applying were the criminals, so they were forced between two options: criminal cops or no cops. This is where lesson 1 from the author comes in. This advice is to deepen and broaden the applicant process. What does this mean? It means we have to figure out how to get more people to apply for certain positions. But not just more people, we also need to broaden or diversify the people that are applying to these positions so we have more people to pick from. But that's just one part of the problem. Another lesson is to use sortition and shadow governance for oversight. Sortition is the action of selecting or determining something by the casting or drawing of lots. In shadow governance, the author describes this as a citizens' advisory panel. So an example of sortition the author gives us comes from the early 20th century. This example is known as Galton's parable. In 1907, Sir Francis Galton asked 787 villagers to guess the weight of an ox. None of them got the answer right, but when Galton averaged their guesses, he arrived at nearly perfect estimate, showing when a large number of people use the collective mind and you average the responses, you get extremely close to the right answer. From this, the author gives us a possible solution on how we can apply that in today's society. He proposes an annual citizen assembly that is randomly chosen, which is sortition, and that would act like an advisory board, which is shadow governance for oversight, that would weigh in on political decision making. Politicians would would not have to take the advice, but it would make it brutally clear when a politician is making questionable decisions, and it would force them to answer for diverting from the citizens' advice. And still, that is just one part of the equation, and that's where the lesson to rotate and to reduce abuse comes into play. Rotate people around so nobody gets too comfortable, because fresh blood doesn't just bring fresh perspective, it also protects us against corruption. An example the author gives us is a story that comes from the UK. Helen King is an assistant commissioner for the Metropolitan Police. During her career, corruption was flying under the radar for quite some time. A certain department in the police force was producing above average results, always ready to take a case. This department was Undercover Drug Bust Department. What was unknown to the commissioner was that these officers were so eager to take cases because they would seize the drugs, only report a fraction of what was seized, and turn around and sell the product back to drug lords for their own selfish financial interests. In the aftermath, King believes this corruption was allowed to flourish because of how isolated this department was from the rest of the group. In her words, if you allow teams, whether it's 2 uniformed officers or an entire drug team, to work in isolation from others and to work very closely over a long period of time, that's where quite a lot of corruption cases will come out of. So the philosophy behind this is to rotate people, because when you leave groups of people isolated for long periods of time, they form bonds, and when people trust one another, they can create their own interests. And when you create your own interests that diverge from the main group, that's how corruption starts. So how else may we defeat corruption? We can start auditing decision-making processes and not just results. As humans, we often audit and criticize past decision-making once we have seen it has resulted in failure, but never look into the decision-making process when things go right. We often attribute progress to bad leaders when it was luck or manipulation, and often criticize good leaders when bad things happen. Humans naively believe in a false notion that there's a straight line between cause and effect, when often the reality is it's a lot more nuanced than that. An example comes from the 20th century because history is littered with leaders who receive undeserved praise. Mussolini, a facet dictator that's often credited with the railroad and transit station infrastructure and also having on-time performance, but when looking back on it, it's not true. His construction focused on the elitist portion of the population while ignoring the common commuters. During his dictatorship, hundreds of people died in construction work as well. The truth is that most of Italy's railroads were in a sorry state after World War I, but most of the investments made for repair and reform came before Mussolini. But like any good dictator does, he took credit for the decisions made by others. Another story at odds with the decision-making process is the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger explosion. Evidence concludes that it could have been avoided if more attention was paid to the damaged O-rings. It was instead ignored by the people in power to fix it, probably because it hadn't resulted in failure yet. It had already made successful launches. The decision-making process wasn't scrutinized until an accident that resulted in the loss of life. The lesson is learning from major success is just as important from learning from failure. The next lesson in line is the weight of responsibility. Whenever power can be abused, it's crucial to remind those who wield it of their corresponding responsibility. The UK has a good way of reminding their prime ministers of the responsibility of the power they wield. This protocol is known as letters of last resort. The UK has 4 nuclear submarines known as the Trident, and for months the nuclear submarines patrol undetected. The secrecy of their positioning is paramount, almost like a game of Battleship. The reason is because if enemies knew the location of these subs, they could attack them, leaving the UK vulnerable. If you were to nuke the UK, you could be sure to receive a nuke back. This is known as mutually assured destruction. The letters of last resort is what the new prime minister is briefed on to remind them of the responsibilities they possess. These letters are essentially orders beyond the grave. There's no formal thing to write, but there are 4 main options, and I'm curious to hear what you guys think. But the 4 main options are: 1. Retaliate. 2. Don't retaliate. 3. Put the submarine under command of the US Navy. And 4. Leave it up to the commander of the submarine to make a decision. What do you think? Brian Klaas, the author, gives us another important lesson, which is watched people are nice people. Now, I know on subsurface level, this does sound very dystopian, but let's get into it and see what he really means by this. Watched people are nice people. This can easily be portrayed as a dystopian surveillance state, but if this statement is true, then what can be derived from it? Before major dominating religions, you had these smaller local religions. And these pre-modern religions, as far as we can tell, had a parochial or limited moral scope, and this left the old world governments weak compared to today's governments. So back then, the further you were away from the king or the ruling class, the more you can get away with. And maybe you're wondering why. It's because without today's dominating religions or major religions, coupled with the distance you were from the ruling class or the king, you didn't feel the pressure of the watchful gaze of Big Brother. So, just as the acronym MAD can stand for mutually assured destruction, it can also mean mutually assured damnation. Shared belief creates social cohesion. The new religions had a wider moral scope, so even if no one was around, one may tend to behave better because of the belief in a watchful God. That sounds very interesting. What do you guys think? Now we're drawing to an end here, but I would like to leave you with one final lesson. And that lesson is exploit randomness to maximize deterrence while minimizing invasion of privacy. Now I know that was a mouthful, but let's get into it. Oftentimes when people know they are being audited, they creatively hide the corruption and find other ways to stay ahead and pocket the benefits. This is where randomizing audits or scrutiny can help deter those who are corrupt. If they don't know when they are being audited, it can leave them always feeling watched, kind of like the lesson we just talked about. An example can be a typical drug bust in New York City. The DEA has been informed of a drug dealer, but because of problems obtaining a proper warrant to search the apartment, the DEA reaches out to local New York City police. They ask the officer to watch the place to make sure the bus is still good while they obtain a valid warrant. With the officer alone, he decides to climb up the apartment's fire escape ladder. When he gets to the window, he can tell no one's home, and he can see bags of drugs and wads of cash. He lets himself in, he counts $20,000 in cash, without the DEA present, and the DEA having no way of knowing how much drugs or cash the bus will yield. The officer shoves $6,000 under his protective vest. He figures that $14,000 in cash and bags of drugs will still be a desirable bus, and that what he's done won't shed any attention his way. Even if the drug dealer complains that some of the cash is missing, it will be the word of a badge holder against the criminal. When the officer completes his shift, he is arrested. What he didn't know was that it was all set up and he was the subject in question. Internal Affairs posed as DEA to catch corruption behind the badge. It was an integrity test, and he failed. When officers are asked if they feel like they have been targeted by Internal Affairs, they reported they've been audited 12 times more than reality. This gives us insight. If you randomize audits on corruption, corruptibles have a hard time staying ahead. I find that interesting. And that is all we have time for today. There was a lot of information and stories that I did not cover, and so I do recommend reading this book. And like I previously stated, you can find this book on Amazon, or I'm sure you can find it at local bookstores. But if you made it this far, I appreciate it, and thank you. Take care.